Welcome back to the podcast, guys. This week, we're going to talk about something very, very important, and that is feedback, getting feedback on your tracks. Also, if you have ever given feedback to somebody else, especially in the sync licensing business, for those of you that are Sync Academy members, I'm looking in your direction because you guys have probably been active in our feedback corner group. That's where anybody in Sync Academy can post a track for the entire community, for all of your peers to actually give you some feedback on. It's been really, really valuable and useful and helpful and motivating for a lot of you guys that have participated in it. But of course, we need to be careful about who we get feedback from, why we're getting feedback from them, and of course, once we do get that feedback, how do we respond to it, right? How do we interpret it? Does it need to be something that we initially take personally and really overanalyze and overthink? Is it something that we should just say, well, if I disagree with them, I'll just disregard it and ignore it because I know that my tracks are great? There's a lot of gray area in all of this stuff, and there's never really one for sure straight answer for any of this kind of stuff. You really have to be weighing who you're getting your feedback from, how they're telling you this feedback, and decide whether or not it's some sort of insight that you really should put into your practice where you can start changing either how you produce, mix, or master your tracks, okay? So this is obviously for me personally something that I've dealt with in my sync licensing career. Getting feedback from library owners, also other producers that are just not necessarily in the sync licensing business, but just professional music producers as well. And it is sometimes some of the hardest things, some of the hardest times to be told that your track just wasn't good enough, that it wasn't quite hitting the mark. Sometimes getting feedback that helps you improve it, but other times just a straight out rejection saying, you know, we just can't take this track and here's the reasons why. So it's still feedback, but there's really no chance to redeem it. There's no chance to actually go forward with it. So it's always tough, it's always tricky, and I don't care who you are, we all have an ego, we all have some sort of a pride in our music, in our work, in our art. So to have somebody not entirely tell us that they absolutely loved it is never really what we want to hear. But it is one of those things that you have to learn how to get used to, because that's how you're going to improve, is to get valuable feedback that's actually honest. It's the same thing like when you go to a doctor and you actually had like terminal cancer. Do you want your doctor to sort of sugarcoat it and not really tell you the truth of what you're dealing with? Or do you want them to really just tell you, this is what you're dealing with, here's your timeline, here's your odds of actually surviving this thing? For myself, I would rather just be told the truth. It's going to hurt, it's going to suck, it's going to be really traumatic, but at least I know what I'm dealing with. At least I know where I'm at. And of course, you got to make sure that that's the right doctor you should be getting that advice from, okay? Not some guy that just has a lab coat on and says, sure, I'm a doctor. It's actually somebody that you have credibility with. It's somebody that you actually believe, hey, if they say that I got a problem, I think I really do have a problem. So obviously having a trust, having a relationship with the person that's giving you feedback is, of course, paramount to all of this stuff. So with that out of the way, I'm joined again, once again, with Mike, by Mike and Trevor this week. And I want to actually go through their personal experiences, maybe as producers first, guys. If you guys can tell us a little bit, maybe if there's one or two stories that jump out at you in terms of a time that you got feedback from maybe a client, a library owner, or just another producer where it was probably really challenging to hear that. Mike, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
It's first off, I wanted to say it's a little bit, I've had a little bit different experiences between getting feedback from library owners and then also from doing a custom job. So let's start with like the library side. There's definitely been times in my career where I've gotten, feedback from, where I'd submit stuff and, that they'd either give me like a whole list of revisions to try to get it somewhere. And if I'm just not hitting it or whatever the case is, and then, they'll just kind of come back and be like, yeah, this isn't really up to par. And of course, in my mind at that time, I'm trying my best. I'm thinking that it is up to par. I'm taking a listen to all the reference tracks. I think the challenging thing a lot of times is not necessarily connecting on where in the reference tracks that, we both are listening to. And sometimes it's just a communication thing in the sense of like, maybe they're not able to communicate properly to me what the what they're gravitating towards in the references or for me to change, or maybe I'm not necessarily hearing it properly. So, I've in the beginning, that used to like kind of, like when you get a rejection and stuff like that, like, that used to kind of hit me a little bit in the sense of like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe this, and you go through all those emotions of, feeling, kind of dejected to kind of anger in the sense of like, okay, well, I guess I'll just find somebody else to give this to, and I'll show you kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's like, just like anything else, it's, the library has a brand, they have like a sort of a measure of quality that they need to live up to and everything like that too. And I think for the most part, libraries, if they're working with you, they want to get your tracks there. So for the most part, as far as handling rejection with libraries, it hasn't, like I said, it's more about like an artistic thing, I guess, for me. And then like on the other side with a lot of custom jobs, I found that when tracks either get rejected or whenever there's feedback coming back that's like, okay, well, this isn't exactly right or whatever, I've found that it usually has nothing to do with the tracks themselves, or what's in the tracks, whether it's hitting the brief or the references or not. It has more to do with somebody somewhere having a very specific idea. And usually with custom jobs, there's just a lot of people in that chain that's making decisions. So all the way to the point to where the person that makes the final decision might have a completely different idea as to what they're looking for from all the creatives that came in between. So
awesome. Trevor, how about you? Any stories that stand out?
I mean, like rejection is from like the day one until this morning for me, and I think that's true for everybody. You just, that's part of the journey, and it's part of the things that get you better and stuff. And so like I have plenty of examples of just, oh, this sounds dated, or the mix is like the mix is this way, or it's too muddy, or like there's so many things that can be like picked apart by a client and stuff. And my approach is usually the customer is always right kind of scenario. And I'm not the customer, right? We're used to being the customer in our own lives for most things, right? But in this scenario, you're actually they're the customer, and their needs and their complaints, whether you agree or not, don't matter, because they're the ones with, the money or the whatever, the contract or whatever it is that's going on. And so they're the ones who are coming to you and being like, hey, I'm the customer and I'm always right. And so taking that, and then the idea of turning every little failure into basically a learning experience, putting those two things together just kind of makes the journey, I guess, less like frustrating and stressful, because then it's like, okay, I'm taking myself out of it by doing what I wanted to do. Like I did it how I thought I should do it. Now they're the ones taking it apart because they want X, Y, and Z. So it's on them now. So I'm just going to do what they want. Right. And then also, like looking at that and being like, because I came from, when I first started, hip hop beats, right? Just trying to get on the rappers and get with them and get, and their feedback is usually just, this sucks. That's like usually what they say. Like, you're not going to just dissect it. And, so like, if you can't take that, then like, if you can't somehow soften that blow, then like the library, because most libraries in general, they're not going to email you and be like, this sucks, right? They're going to be like, it's this. They're going to like soften the blow. yeah. And maybe they should, I don't know. But anyway, so they're going to, let's soften the blow a little bit. And so what I've learned though, what I learned then and what I learned almost every single time I get any kind of feedback is like, there is some truth in what they're saying. Like I did suck at that time, or my track is dated, or the brass isn't wide like it should be. Like there is truth in it, as much as I don't want to admit it. And so then I look at it, and even if I don't agree in the scenario, then I approach it as like, well, that's what they want, so let's just do that. And I think kind of taking those two approaches and constantly trying to move forward or upward, or however you want to call it, kind of helps along with that process, so that you can come out with two positives. You come out with, you gave them what they wanted, and also you're better than you were beforehand, like as a producer or engineer, or however, whatever the term, whatever the thing is. And so my stories are basically those, right? It's that equation. It's this, we didn't like it, or it sucked, or it was bad. Make these changes, and me going, all right, I'm out of it now. It's not my creative, I'm just here to please. So I do that, and then success. Now I go to the next thing. And so like, yeah, I mean, I can do specific stories, I guess, but that's kind of the formula that ends up,
yeah, I appreciate
my failure journey. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like that point you made, that you win twice, actually, when you actually are able to make those changes, because absolutely you're going to probably learn something with that feedback. So something struck me as you guys were talking is that pain and discomfort, and even maybe some annoyance at getting feedback, is pretty much always going to serve a purpose for you. Now, I want to tell two stories of my career, and there are two different types of tracks that I put together. Not different genres, but definitely two different types of approaches I had to the music and the different types of feedback I got and why I learned from both of them. So the two different types of tracks I put together was, one was I really tried very hard. Like I really tried hard to make a really poppy, catchy top 40 track. Multiple tracks actually. And I went to not a sync licensing producer, but just a well-known producer that had some hits and had some connections in the industry. And he said he'd give me some feedback. So those are the ones like my heart and soul were really in it. The other types of tracks that I've gotten some feedback on that were negative feedback, just critical feedback, were tracks that I basically crammed into the end of a sync licensing album that I really didn't spend that much time on and I didn't really care about. And I honestly just fast tracked it. I really just half-assed, like basically probably 5 or 6 tracks. So I was like, I have to get this full album done. I don't really feel like this, I don't like this genre anymore, whatever, here you go. And so I've gotten feedback from both of those, and both of them hurt, both of them sucked, but for very different reasons. And so I want to basically talk about those. So for the first ones, the ones that I was basically, this is when I was before, I think this was basically before sync licensing. I was really getting into trying to write, hit pop songs, dance songs, that kind of a thing. And it was a couple of songs I really put my heart and soul in. I mean, I was listening to them over and over again, and getting high on my own supply, that kind of a thing. Played it for this well-renowned producer, did really well for himself. And he basically, in a polite way, in his own nice way, said like, this kind of sounds like a demo. You're not really there yet. The drums really aren't hitting hard enough. The sounds you're using kind of sound very elementary, almost like kiddie sounds. They don't really sound like mature sounds. I mean, he just one at a time just destroyed all of my tracks, right? But in a very like pinpointed way. He didn't just say, oh, that sucks, get that out of my speaker system. He did tell me exactly what was not working. Now, this popped my balloon. I mean, I thought I was here, and the feedback he gave me made me feel like, no, I'm actually right here. So that hurt. That really sucked. I didn't like to hear that. I don't remember getting mad at him, but I just remember not liking that feeling of like inadequacy, like, man, or just feeling like I thought I was much further along this path than I really am. But, so that was pain. That was definitely a painful moment. So what I did with that, though, is he actually ended up sending me some of his tracks that he had completed, and I started in my own home studio A/B comparing and going, okay, what are his tracks doing? What are mine doing? And I started to see he's absolutely right. Like his drums are just knocking out of this thing, and mine are just barely there. His samples feel more rich, and they fill up the EQ spectrum much more. Mine are very thin, and my whole mix just sounds like I'm missing a big chunk of the EQ spectrum. Like there's no low end or no thud or whatever it was. And so that pain turned into motivation. And so I basically started realizing that there's a lot of improvement that I need to do for my music, okay? So that was good pain in the end. In the short run, didn't feel good, but in the end, I'm really glad because it basically, kept me back down. And now I listen to those tracks, 12, 13, 14 years later, and I'm like, I was really, really high on my own supply there. I was nowhere near ready to release that kind of stuff publicly or to actually think that some major pop artist would have bought those tracks from me or anything like that. So that was good. In the long run, it was really good. The other side were these tracks that I really just kind of half-assed, sent it to a library, basically just kind of crammed it into the end of this album and just said, here you go. Hope you don't notice that the last 5 are kind of stinkers, And of course, the library owner noticed that they were really, really bad, and basically rejected them and just said, I don't know. And they gave me feedback, like honest, critical, detailed feedback. But what that pain was a little bit different because what they were doing is they were calling me out on something that I already knew, right? They were calling me out on my own lack of going the full mile, to really giving my all to my work. That was definitely a half-assed 5 out of 10 approach. They called me out on it. And I noticed actually those are the situations when I've gotten that kind of feedback, I actually get more mad at the person than I get mad at myself. And it makes sense because you want to protect yourself. You don't want to own the responsibility of like, that was me. Like I definitely screwed that one up. That was definitely all on me. And so I initially found that when that kind of feedback would hit, and I got mad at them, that was my indicator that like, I'm probably getting mad at them. Now I can see that, not at the time, but now I can see that if I was getting mad at the person for the feedback, a lot of times they were probably pointing something out that was very true. And I probably subconsciously or deep down somewhere knew that was absolutely what I was doing. So that's just something I would tell all of you guys watching now, that if you find that you kind of go inward with the feedback, get a little bit painful and kind of go, I don't hate that person, but it just makes me think I need to do something more. It's probably because you have nothing to hide, nothing shameful, or no sort of like lack of effort on your part. You probably did everything you're supposed to do, but you're just getting some honest feedback that's helping you grow. However, if you find that when you get feedback, you attack the person, right? And you go like, well, you're an idiot and you don't know what you're talking about. Or even if you never say that to them, but you just feel these things or you think these thoughts. double check yourself, because they might be, if it's a credible person like a library owner or somebody that you trust, they might just be pointing out something uncomfortable that you've already done inside of yourself. So anyways, with that being said, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually. So that brings me back to like actually a specific story that I have too. So when I first started doing trailer music, I was writing, and so basically I had come off of this huge sort of project that I did for NBC, and wrote a lot of cues for their promos and stuff like that. So after that, I really wanted to get into trailer music, so I took a lot of those and tried to make a new album, whatever, for a trailer library. And I remember, of course, I was like, part of the opening of that relationship was like, oh, they saw my credits. They're like, oh, you did this, and that's awesome. We're honored to have you, kind of thing, right? And so I felt like really high, like, going in. But then, as I started to work on the album, started getting feedback, I got a lot of feedback where it's just like, yeah, this just isn't hitting hard enough. Like all those kinds of things. And I remember feeling a little bit, well, first off, I felt tight a little bit for two reasons. Number one, I was just like, oh, I mean, who are you to tell me this? I'm already getting placements. That's like, it's like, right. I'm already working. I could just take this out, like, I don't have to give this music to you. I could just take it out and just get my own clients, which, I guess thinking back, that's kind of what I did anyway, but not with that particular music. But anyway, for the story, so I was feeling tight about that, and then at the same time, part of our deal was that they would mix and master the tracks at the end. So a lot of the references I was going after and stuff like that, just I didn't have access to other trailer style like library tracks, how they were in the library. So my references came from YouTube videos and stuff like that. And so a lot of times my production, obviously when you're A/Bing to that, it's not exactly the same. You're missing out on some, a bunch of frequencies and stuff like that too. But in my head, I was just like, oh, it's all there. They're just going to fix it up in the mix. Like, so where how close I thought I was to the end was not as close as it needed to be. And whenever they pointed that out, and it was a back and forth, everyone was, for the most part, was really cool about it and everything like that. I just know that for me, I had this obstacle of number one being like, well, if you guys are going to mix it, like, I don't think there's any more room to add the things that you're adding. I think this is a mix issue, so to me, I was like, well, this is just the last 5-10% that's on you guys. And then on top of that, I had to get over this whole thought of like, well, it's sounding, I think what you're asking for is like something specific that sounds like all this other stuff. And I'm trying to do something different, and not realizing that, that's like kind of an artist mentality. You want to have your own voice, but not realizing that like what they're asking for is what they knew worked to get placements. And that at the end of the day, that's trying to help me out, because of they don't want my music just sitting in their library not doing anything. So if it doesn't make them money, it doesn't make me money. But of course at the time I didn't see it as that way. And so whenever we just kind of like we kind of deaded the project mutually, as I couldn't get there, that was one of the last points of feedback. But the funny thing was, the last points of feedback was it just got to a point where they're just like, yeah, this just isn't good enough, But the funny thing is, I think throughout that process of going back and forth and trying to understand, by the time I heard that this is not good enough, it didn't affect me in the same way anymore. That's when I realized, like, right when they said that, I realized like, okay, maybe they're right. Let me take some time out to study and stuff like that. So. And
so you grew from that experience. So that's awesome, man. Yeah, that's really cool.
Totally.
Yeah, and I have both of you touched on two things that I think are something I see a lot of. Mike, you had brought up almost an inflated ego kind of scenario where it's like, well, I'm too good for this project anyway, kind of thing. Which I'm not saying it's not good to have like confidence level as you grow. You kind of like take steps upwards, and at some point, like if you don't want to reach too far down or whatever, because you're improving and getting bigger, like, or however you want to call it. But there have been so many scenarios in this industry that I've seen where people like think that their step up that's like this high is like this high. And they're like, oh, well, I did this one project with this artist one time, so now all this work down here is I'm above it. but then they're up here not doing anything for a long time. And that like, well, I mean, it's your life, but I've been in scenarios where I see people who look down on work that will do things like pay their like projects, and they'll look down on it that will like pay their bills, move them forward in the industry, like all that kind of stuff, get them royalties. But they like allow that idea to keep them hovering over that work. And I just like, I mean, like I said, it's their life and all, but it kind of makes me sad in a way, because it's like there's so much here that you can just jump into, and you're kind of getting in your own way. And then the other thing, which I forgot Jesse's, it was on Jesse's point, your story on
well, I had the two different tracks. One I really tried hard on, the one that I really half-assed.
Oh no, yeah, I have a personal one of that where I remember when the Harlem Shake came out and there was that trap that like everybody needed to trap all of a sudden. Nobody even knew what it really was. And I remember doing a 10 track or maybe even 12 track album. And I remember the first first 5, I was just like dove into it. They were solid. I was like, I love these tracks. And then I started getting further and further into the album. And I was just throwing them together. And I'm like, you know what? I'm checking off the boxes, right? I got trap drums. I got that synth thing, but it just wasn't the same. And my heart wasn't in it. And I remember being frustrated when they were like coming back with notes, and it was clear to them and it was clear to me, but I was getting in my own way. I was like, how dare you? Like, I'm doing everything on the checklist, there's trap drums, but I knew deep down that I was being lazy once I hit track 8, track 9, track 10, and so it was one of those. It's funny because I criticize people now when they do it, but I did it too. And and so that's definitely a good lesson. I think most of us learn, not just in music, but in like life in general, where you kind of get that level of like, I'm just, I'm phoning it in for the last couple. And then when somebody calls you out on it, you kind of like fight back because you don't want to like truly admit to yourself that you're phoning it in, So It's a good story. And I'm sure all of us have that. And that one like came right away, because I remember afterwards, after I kind of had my frustration moment, I remember just sitting back being like, man, I was a punk for that,
It hurts, yeah, because somebody calling you out on stuff is true, but you don't want to accept it. You're in denial about it. So yeah, that always hurts. It's always uncomfortable. I do want to talk real quickly about what you said about, artists or producers that do that elevating thing with their ego, thinking like, well, I had that big placement last year, so I don't do reality shows anymore, or I don't do, some sort of one-off royalty-free gig. I don't do that stuff anymore because I'm in the big leagues now. I really think trying to impress people in this industry is a big waste of time. I think actually, if you come to this industry thinking that you're going to show off your way to success, you're dreaming. You're probably in some other reality. You should, rather than think about that stuff, think about how you can serve people, right? Doesn't mean, like Trevor said, you don't have to say yes to every gig. If it's just like $100 to do a song, you're like, you know what? I probably would be better using my time doing something else or whatever. Make your choice, but coming to a gig and listing your accomplishments to try to impress your way into getting hired, or impress your way to, like, at some point, some of that stuff maybe makes a little bit of a difference to show credibility. But really what it comes down to is like, can you be useful for the project, for the client, for the library, for the supervisor, for whoever you're working with? Those that are going to be able to kind of get out of your own, you're kind of getting high on your own supply with your, your placements or your past accolades or anything, that kind of thing. Like, I do mention my placements here on my YouTube channel, on my podcast, but mostly just so that you guys that are following me know what I've done, that I'm legit. But I really don't talk to anybody about my placements at all, actually. It's actually not something that's even a topic of conversation. I do feel proud of the accomplishments that I've had, but it's really not something that I'm going out there and putting in people's faces and trying to get on board for new gigs with that. Rather than that, I want to know, what kind of music are you looking for? Do you have a brief? Are you looking for a specific thing? Do my skill sets match with that brief? Do I really honestly, right, not getting delusional, thinking like, oh, you need country hip hop? No problem. I do that all day long. No, I don't. That's actually something I don't do all day long. So I shouldn't be trying to get ahead of myself, or at least let them know I'd like to pitch to it, but it's not one of my fortes. But if it's like, pop or rock or EDM or something that I have a lot more forte experience in, like, I want to come to the table with a service mindset. I want to get you many track options. I want to get them to you on time. I want to get them to you earlier, beforehand. I want to have clear, honest communication with you guys. That's where my entire mindset is. And everything that I've done in the past is pretty much didn't exist. I just try to operate as much as I can on here and now and who I'm really working with. So I do think it's one of those things that you've definitely nailed it right there, Trevor. Like I know so many producers and musicians and artists that get ahead of themselves because they did get some huge placement or some huge sync or something like that. And then they're floating off into clouds and they're somewhere else. And I don't know why they think that they're above working. But I one thing that always resonated with me, one of the libraries that I worked with for many years, the owner actually was pretty sure he was a multi-millionaire. Like he had so many huge placements with his library, major motion pictures, Iron Man, those kind of big trailer pieces and films and that kind of thing. And even he made sort of a call out to basically all of the A&R, the people that worked underneath his company. He said, "There's no gig too small for us." He's like, if it's $50, I want it. If it's $100, I want it. We're not saying no to anything. And this guy didn't need $50. He didn't need $100. But he had this mindset of like, we're here to serve. We're here to make use of our music and to get it out there into as many outlets as we possibly can. Now, of course, I'm sure there were some gigs they just couldn't meet in the middle. But he was basically saying like, for any client that comes out and wants to work with us, I don't care what their budget is. We'll see if we can work with them. And that always stuck with me. With somebody that's got millions of dollars, is still open to working, and not himself personally. He's not going to be making the music, but he was saying as a company, I'm sure we have some producers or some writers or somebody that might want to work with those kind of opportunities. So I think just staying hungry, just always staying hungry, staying available, and not ever closing yourself off to things because you think you're above it all. I think that's a really important thing. Now, I do want to talk also about giving feedback, because obviously the three of us here, we have extensive experience doing that. Mike and Trevor own their own companies, music libraries, and boutique music firms. So they obviously are giving feedback to their producers, songwriters all day long, all the time. But of course, if you guys are not familiar with what we do, is I have a group called the Syndicate, where all three of us actually give feedback to the members. So sometimes it's in video form. We'll actually get on video, play their song on video and give them notes. But most of the time what we'll do is we'll actually give them written notes for their licensing opportunities that we post to that private group, okay? So I definitely want to talk about some of our best practices on why we think these practices work well and why they're, I've seen, at least from what I've seen, have been more effective. And I guess one of the reasons why I want you guys to hear this is that if you are in Sync Academy and you're going to the feedback corner, I want you guys to know how to give proper feedback to your fellow members, okay? Because I know most of you guys do already. So this is not really like sort of, I don't mean this to be scolding or trying to teach you guys anything that you don't already know. But we definitely want to make sure that we have the strongest kind of feedback that we can possibly give to each other. And why? Well, because when we can all do that, that means when you post a track, you're going to be getting even better feedback in the future. So definitely pay attention to this next segment, because I think this is something that's going to be useful for all of you, and not just in Sync Academy, but all of you that are just going for sync licensing in general, and you might want to get some of your friends to give you some feedback. Well, the first way to teach people how to do this stuff is you give them great feedback first and show them an example of, here's how good, send me a track. I'm going to show you how great feedback can be constructed, so that when you send them a track, hopefully they picked up on that and they can give you some helpful feedback as well. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and get started? What are some of your best practices or tips that you use when you give feedback for your writers or members?
Yeah, so I'm going to break this down actually into three different sort of categories, because it's a little bit different. So first, I'm going to talk about like the way that I work with my composers for library albums, and then the way I work with composers on custom jobs, and then also the Syndicate. So for when it comes to library albums and stuff like that, yes, most of the communication is through email. And through written notes, but sometimes, I do have the opportunity to kind of have a conversation. Now, the first thing that I always listen for is, I listen for the concept of the track that's being given to me in accordance to the brief. So what does that actually mean? It's like, well, it's basically like, so if a brief is calling for a certain type of emotion, I want to make sure that that the track that I'm getting is hitting, or at least getting close to that emotion first. And then, from there, I'm able to see like, okay, well, what needs to be added, what needs to be taken away that can make the track better for what it is, and thus, get it to hitting the brief even more, So for instance, if we get like a track that's a really good track, but it's just not hitting the brief, I'm not going to try to pick it apart to try to, sort of reverse engineer that track to hit the brief. It's more like, hey, listen, this is a great track. You should finish it and have it go this way. but like that's for that, so I need you to do a rewrite or whatever it is, for this particular brief. So it's a similar thing when it goes to like for custom jobs, but for custom jobs it's a little bit trickier just because there's so many more nuances. Like for me, I'm trying to interpret the creative direction from let's say the ad agency, or the creative that I'm talking to from the ad agency, but then it goes beyond that to trying to interpret what their boss is thinking, and the whole way, and and just trying to keep on brand and everything like that too. So for instance, in that example with my composers, it's more like if they hit the genre right, they hit the production, everything like that right. But the thing is, there's something specific about that brand that just needs to be there. That's where I'll push to be like, okay, you got to add this, or you got to take that out. That's just not their brand, whether it makes sense or not. And at the end of the day, for both of those, it's just really all about communication. So, and to me, like, I'm really honest, about everything. So, I tell everybody, is like, hey, I'm going to be honest with you. You're not going to like it all the time, but at the end of the day, it's just like, I don't want to be wasting time to trying to, because I'm guessing too as to what exactly is going to sell to my clients. I have a better sort of knowledge as to what they're looking for than you do. So I'm able to better direct you in that way. But at the same time, like I'm going to be honest with you to make sure that we can get a win out of this. So yeah. And then when it comes to the syndicate, I'm a lot more thorough when it comes to that, because I see the syndicate as it's a learning platform, so, like, so it always starts with like, okay, well, where does this track sit? What is the emotion of this track? What is the concept of this track? Does that fit with the brief? And then everything goes in line with that. Okay, well, it's fitting with the brief, but it's not quite there. So what do I need to do to get it there, right? And a lot of times it's like, okay, wait, I like this, but I need more of it, So, and a lot of what I hear from, I don't necessarily hear composers or producers doing things wrong, or doing the wrong thing. Most of the time, most of what I'm hearing is a lot of people being too safe. It's like I hear a cool idea that somebody does, and then either it just never comes back or it's never fleshed out. You know what I mean? And, and I think it's like, I get the sense that maybe they're thinking artistically, oh, this is really cool, let me do this. But then like, I don't know if this is great this is like what I would do for my music, but for a job, I don't really know. And I think that's where, especially in the syndicate that I've seen, where I want to be thorough as far as like trying to direct people towards their own unique voice, plus hitting the brief, because I think that is also really important in standing out in this business too.
Absolutely. Great points, man. How about you, Trevor?
Yeah, it's funny. There's actually a bunch of things that I think about before I even like look at the music in a way, or not look at the music, but like that I go to like to consider once I hit play, like right when I hit play. And there's like, here's one thing that I used to do a lot that I have to not do as much anymore. I don't as much anymore, but it's something I had to like phase out of myself, which is to separate usability with what I like as the person listening to somebody's music, not as the composer, but as somebody who's listening to submissions. There's times where I'll listen to a track and I'm like, whew, I can listen to this like 3 more times, but it's also like way too complex, got way too much going on. It's too cool. And as a listener, I'm just like, yeah, I'll listen to this again. But then as somebody who's looking at music as something that can be as a product, it doesn't work. And so like, that's something that I have to like right at the beginning, I got to think about that. Like, does this work in the business part? Because it's like, we're not getting paid if I listen to it 10 times. Like, it doesn't do anything to anybody. But if a client listens to it and it's way too messy, then it's just going to sit in my library and nobody's going to ever use it because, of whatever. So that's one big thing that especially lately I've had to kind of, because there have been times where I'll do that. I'll be like, you know what? I love that track. I'm bringing it in. Let's do this. And then it like never gets placed. And for a while I had to ask myself, like, why is this not getting placed? And it's like, oh, it's because I'm listening to it as a fan and not as like as a product that's usable, right? So there's that, which then I've started to really try and cater my notes in that realm too, because whenever I give somebody some type of feedback, like it was hard at first for me to be like, I'm declining this, and then in my heart, I'm like, I don't like that I'm declining it because I like the track, but I got to explain why, right? And so, and the reasons why are usually like, you just got too much going on, there's, whatever the reasons are. So that's one factor that I think is hard for both sides to grasp, especially the composer, because the composer probably knows that their track is pretty good. And they're just like, what the heck, man? Like, it's good. And it's hard to swallow that pill. And so to see it as the composer now, to see it from where the library or the company or ad or whoever is coming from, it maybe like this drops the pill a little bit easier that way. Cause it's like, okay, they do like it. It just doesn't work in this, how this is going. So there's that. And then after that kind of like, is it usable? Then I start going into the like quality of the sounds and the mix and all that kind of stuff. And then depending on the album, obviously, like the mood, right? Like if an album really needs to do an emotion, like Mike was talking about, then it's kind of like, okay, does this thing make me feel that emotion? Or is it just like I've said many times, is it just a checkbox of things? Like, is it a checkbox of like the sad sounding piano, or does this piano actually make me feel sad? Right? Like there's definitely a difference. And so like going down kind of the lanes of like, which all actually ends up coming back to that first point, which is all of these things are subjective checkboxes, not real checkbox. Like a real checkbox is real sounding drum kick, real sounding snare, but a subjective drum checkbox is high quality sounding kick drum, high quality. But those things all funnel into like the final goal of usability, and that's kind of how I approach it, is this kind of funnel of all of those topics slowly funneling into, okay, now can a client use this? Because is it good? Do I like it? Does it have all of the things that it should have in it? None of that matters if the client will never use it. And so that's kind of like my reverse engineer of doing feedback, and how I've kind of been like, okay, I need to make sure that people understand how to make it through that entire funnel to get into a library or into a project or whatever, because it's not just, well, it's a trap track like that, so that would be kind of like an explanation of my process.
Yeah, thank you. That really helps explain it, actually. And it's always that age-old problem of art and commerce getting together, and that's exactly where we are in this business. Is like you got these great subjective ideas, you got these great artistic ideas, but is it, and I always use the big word, licensable? That's why it's the big word that I always, highlight, and I always sort of capitalize, because licensability is really the name of the game here. It's not actually, like Trevor said, whether or not your track is catchy or good or complex or any of those kind of things. Can it actually get placed? Like, that's what we're in this business for. And that is a tricky thing just to know. And there was actually one story, Trevor, where you kind of reminded me of this. One of the ways that we grade tracks in the syndicate is we have this A, B, or C grading system. A, if you get an A, it means your track has been accepted. So you did something right. So whatever you did, if you get an A, keep doing that because it really worked. You followed the brief. You have great samples you're working with, great musical ideas, transitions. You followed all the specifics, the track length, all that kind of stuff. You did everything you were supposed to do. Awesome. B means that your track could be accepted, but it needs to be revised. So it's basically like saying you did follow the brief and you are using the right sounds and the right emotion, but something just isn't quite working. So it could be that your melodies are kind of plain or boring sounding, depending on what the brief is. It could be that your drums just are kind of too loopy. You're using like a 1/4 bar or a 1-bar progression, and you just keep looping that. I don't know. There's a million and one different reasons why maybe your track is in the right ballpark, but it's just not in the right form yet. The execution isn't quite there. And so those are the ones that I will work with you guys to revise it to get them better. Now, C means that your track did not hit the mark, right? Most of the time it means you did not follow the brief. And just like Mike was saying that if you get a C, it pretty much means I can almost guarantee what you should do is not just immediately open up your DAW and try again. Oh, no, that's the wrong thing to do. What you should do is go reread the brief. Go watch the instructional video. All of our opportunities usually have an instructional video. And go listen to the references. And don't probably compose for maybe half a day, maybe a couple of hours at the least. But you definitely need to spend some time absorbing what is being asked of you and listening, maybe on repeat, those reference tracks over and over again. Because most of the time I find what people are doing is either they're trying to cram some other pre-made track into this brief and it doesn't fit, or they just got excited by an opportunity, saw orchestral, and then pulled up all their strings and horns and started going for it. But they didn't read the second part, which was that it needs to be sad and somber, or it needs to be, an iconic kind of a theme. And so they're composing something that's more for like the background, but it's like, no, we need something that's going to be thematic and something that's going to really come out and pop out and have people go like, oh, I recognize that theme, right? So again, some of these things just come down to really listening and reading and really paying attention to what you're being asked of. And so I can speak one last part about also when Trevor said that sometimes, and also Mike, you said this about how you'll get great tracks, but they're just not right for the brief. And so you don't really necessarily kind of pull teeth to try to get them to fit. You're just like, you know what, this track just works for this other opportunity or for something else, and let's just call it that. And you didn't necessarily follow the brief, but that's okay. You're not a bad producer. It just, this one didn't fit. So that would be like the C grading for us. I do remember having one syndicate member who we were asked to compose a sort of, I think it was like an EDM sort of bass heavy, very quick 30-second piece for a commercial. He had sent in basically an orchestral like trailer style thing. Did have an electronic bass in it, but it definitely was not following with what they wanted, because I remember we got like a Katy Perry track as a reference. Katy Perry is not putting orchestral trailer music out there, so right off the bat I was just like, But he sent it to me, and he sent it to me in so much confidence, thinking, I know this is going to work out. I spent like all day on it yesterday. I know it exactly works. I've even, I think he paired it with some sort of commercial from that brand that we were working with. So he's like, I've done all my homework. I know this is perfect. And I took it and I was like, no, it's not it. It's really just not it. And I was sorry to break it to him, and he did not want to hear that at all. That was really not the kind of feedback he wanted to hear, because he had just in his mind had already determined this is going to get it. I'm going to be the one that gets this. And it's a little bit of that, kind of, I don't know if it's arrogance or overconfidence. But again, for him, if he had just spent maybe 30 minutes listening to the reference track more, reading the brief, going back and forth, and really making sure he understood, because everybody else's track was more of an EDM kind of a pop style, and the ones that were the strongest, they were the ones that I passed on. Eventually we got one of our members that got the gig, but it's just let there be a lesson for those of you guys that most of the time, reading and following directions is one of the biggest drawbacks for most producers in this business. It's not really necessarily your skills, your producing, your mixing, or mastering abilities, but just the fact that you are able to take direction and then put yourself in that emotional place, however you need to do it. We all have different ways to do that, but just take the time to have a little ritual, turn off the lights, light a candle. I don't care what you have to do, but really put yourself in the mindset emotionally of what really the client wants, because that's the tricky part about this. If you want to just go make music for yourself, just go make music for yourself. Put it out online, and whatever you're feeling that day, just put it out. Nobody should tell you how to do that. You should just do that. But we are here in this art and commerce intersection here with sync licensing. And that means that we need to channel our art and our creativity to serve their needs and make sure our tracks are licensable. So with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys learned something. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and post below maybe a story you guys have about receiving feedback or giving feedback that you guys felt was useful or helpful. I'm here to learn, just as Trevor and Mike are here to learn as well. So we want to learn just as much from you as hopefully you're learning from us. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next week.